So again, yeah, thank you for coming to this talk, even if it took a little while to load the images. But then, yeah, I mean, if there are a few environment artists out there, hello, because this is going to be about environment art. And as I was saying before, I'm going to be focusing on the artist perspective for foliage art, because there is a there is also a technical side which is very broad, and it's very deep and very important as well. But because I'm an artist, this is what I'm going to be talking about. Right, so what is foliage art then? So what makes it slightly different? Why is it becoming a specialty within environment art? What makes it slightly different from, let's say, for example, modeling a house or modeling any other, modular element for environment art? So foliage art consists of making 3D foliage assets. So that is trees, bushes, grasses, you name it, that look good, of course, because as artists, we want it to look good. But then, and this is very important as well, they have to be rendered in real time. What do I mean by that? We will go, we'll be talking about it soon. And then how is it done? I'll be talking about it soon as well. It's related to, I will show you this. So this is a tree. This guy, it's well, it comes from a screenshot from a speed tree. And as you can see, well, it has its trunk, it has its branches, it has its clumps of leaves. And why I was talking, how is it done? What's different about this kind of asset? Right, so this is the same tree, but this is the view of the tree, of the scribed tree, it's called like that, within speed tree. And as you can see, it has its trunk, it has its branches, but then it has something called alpha planes, right? So you see this white arrow that I pointed here. So those planes that you see at the end of the branches, those are the alpha planes. So alpha planes are basically some planes with a texture rendered on top and some alpha. So basically you get to see this. So all those leaves, all those small leaves that you see in there, they are not modeled, they are painted on a plane. So that's something that maybe you already knew. I mean, if you are into environment art, you probably knew already, but I thought it was quite interesting to make clear and to explain before I explain the rest of stuff. So basically, that's what makes it less polycount heavy, because instead of having to model every single leaf, every single twig, you're going to have like different planes. It's still quite heavy and it's still quite difficult to render, because alpha is also something that you learn when you are producing this kind of asset. It's also quite expensive. So right, let's go back. So how is it done? I explained a little bit about the alpha planes, which is, I think, quite important. It's quite essential. But then something that I wanted to say as well about how is it done. It's a software that is usually the most used in the industry to make this kind of assets. So we've got SpeedTree, which is by far the most used foliage software out there. And it's by far, hands down, the most useful one. I would say the most efficient one. It's not for free, but if you are interested in making foliage, if you're interested in making nice trees and grasses and bushes and whatnot, I would say it's a really good idea if you can grab it. And yeah, you can, tinker a little bit with it and, try your stuff and etc., etc. And then another thing, if you are making photorealistic assets, what's most used as well, it's photogrammetry. So meaning that either from a database such as Megascans, or if you take your own inputs, it's quite important that you use textures from photogrammetry textures for trunks, for the branches. I mean, usually you're going to be using the same texture for the trunks and the branches, except for a couple of exceptions, but usually that makes it a lot more expensive. And then also photogrammetry textures for leaves and for twigs. The ones that I was telling you about that you are going to render later on the alpha planes. Cool. So let's move on and let's speak about what I consider the basics from an artist point of view to make foliage assets. So I wrote down these 3. There are many more, as we were saying before, and we are taking into account only the artistic side. But these are reusability, silhouette, and clusters. And now don't worry that I will explain what each thing is and what I think it's important to know about them. Cool. So what do I mean by reusability? So you're going to, for example, you are in a production, right? In a, let's say, a AAA company or a small company, doesn't really matter. And then one day you're there, you're a foliage artist, and your lead comes to you and says, right, I need you to make a birch. And you ask her, okay, which kind of birch? Right, because the first thing, I mean, they are going to give you a brief, they're going to tell you which kind of assets they want. The first thing you have to do, like with the rest of 3D assets, of course, is to look for references. In the case of foliage, that's especially important because, for example, they will tell you, okay, I want you to make a birch, but there are several different species of birches and they are massively different. And you can have a birch that has, like, for example, white bark. You can have a birch that is smaller than another birch that, you know, it has a completely different shape, another one in which the leaves kind of fall down instead of going up. Can be completely different. I mean, that's something that I discovered when I started making foliage, and I was like, yeah, I'm gonna make an oak because I've been asked to make an oak. But yeah, then you start investigating and like, okay, which kind of oak, you know? So that's quite important to also establish exactly, for example, the species of the tree or the bush or the plant. Yeah, especially if it's going to be realistic, if it's stylized, it's another matter. Then that's one thing. And then it's also quite useful to look for references of different ages of the tree or bush. In grasses, it's also important, of course, but trees also vary widely depending on the age. I mean, it's not the same a very young tree and a very old tree, for example. And that's something that you should take into account, hopefully. I mean, you should make very clear you know which kind of tree they want, if they want a younger one. Usually when they say tree is like, you know, average. So, you know, not very young, not very old. But it's interesting to have references. So, right. After you've done that, then we were saying reusability. So you're going to be placing that same birch that we've been, you know, looking a lot of references of, and you're going to be placing it in a lot of different places in your environment. So you need that birch to look interesting from many different perspectives. Right, so for example, in this case, so we've got this tree, it's exactly the same tree, right? But then when we turn it around, we've got a different silhouette. It's still an interesting silhouette. It's arguably, I mean, it could be better, but yeah, you know, it's not too bad. It kind of looks a little bit as, you know, 2 different trees, and it's the same one. So that's what we are trying to do. So we are trying to work on this asset so that it looks organic from any angle, but at the same time, it looks interesting from any angle as well. And that's something that you have to take into account. I mean, in any 3D asset you make that you're going to be placing a lot of times on the same environment. But on foliage is even more important because they are quite memorable. I mean, it's very easy for the eye to recognize kind of like, you know, the same tree, the same shape, etc., etc. So that's one of the things, and it's quite important, and it's one of the basics. So that's something that has to be taken into account, definitely. Right, then the second one, which would be silhouette. What do I mean by silhouette? Because silhouette is it's a quite abstract thing, right? And it's something that as an artist, you always take into account, basically. It has to do with proportions, it has to do with a lot of things. Right, what do I mean by silhouette regarding foliage? So let's see. So we've got this guy again. So our friend from before, the one that I used to teach you about the alpha planes. So this guy, what does he have about its silhouette that it's interesting? So it's very important regarding foliage that you get negative spaces in the silhouette. Sorry, what do I mean by negative spaces? So you see these gaps in between the actual branches and the clumps of leaves. So there are like empty gaps, which is something that you see in nature regarding foliage as well. Because when you are starting and you are making 3D assets for foliage 3D assets, what you try to do is to make something really full, really nice, full of leaves everywhere, right? I mean, super solid everywhere. And it's not like that in nature. If you observe plants, you'll see that they've got gaps, yeah? So it's important to make sure that you've got these gaps, these negative spaces in the silhouette. That's one thing. And then another thing that would be interesting as well, taking into account, and I think it's quite important, is to make a balanced but not very noisy silhouette. What do I mean by that? Again, these are quite abstract things, so it comes with practice, but I think it's a good example. So in here, for example, you see in this same tree, it's a quite good silhouette, it's a quite correct silhouette, because it's quite balanced. I mean, we don't have, for example, a very long branch sprouting and then the rest of them are super short, etc. They are all roughly the same length, roughly the same thickness, roughly. I mean, it's not good that they are super similar to each other either, of course, because it has to look organic, but they are all kind of balanced. And that's something that it pleases the eye, something that we like. I mean, when you start looking at reference actually, and you start trying to make like realistic foliage, actually you see that nature sometimes it gets hideous trees and hideous bushes out there and everything is super unbalanced. But when you are making a 3D asset, and that's something that you learn, I mean, and when you get feedback from, you know, your leads, etc., we like balance. We like something that, you know, it's not too odd shaped, right? So that's one thing. And then another thing is that we need a little bit of noise in this silhouette. So you see that it's not perfectly symmetrical. There are some ins and outs. There is some branch that is kind of like separated from the other. It's a bit irregular. It's slightly noisy. So we want something slightly noisy, but not too noisy either. And that's for two reasons, basically. There are many, but like two main ones would be, one of them is that chances are that you're going to be taking care of the LODs as well. So when you are making a tree, you're going to be making a low-res version of the tree, yeah? Probably several of them, like at least 2 or 3, because they are very heavy and very difficult. Well, not difficult, but like heavy to render, and yeah, they can affect performance. And if you make something too noisy, it's going to be very difficult to make the LODs later on. It's going to pop. I mean, it's going to be difficult to keep the shape. So yeah, you have to keep kind of like a balance. You know, it's not going to. It's going to have some noise because, I mean, of course, it's natural and it's organic. But yeah, you need to keep a balance, something in between. And then the second reason why we don't want something very noisy is because usually you place foliage assets quite close to each other. And usually nature, except for some exceptions, and we've all seen pictures of like the lonely tree in the middle of a field that looks beautiful, etc. But usually what you get is trees growing close to each other, shrubbery growing close to each other, etc. Everything kind of, you know, when there is an area with foliage, there's also more foliage growing around, etc. If the silhouette is too noisy, it's going to be difficult to read all that foliage all together. I mean, it's already difficult with one. And sometimes when you put too much together, there's going to be too much information. You know what I mean? So it's good to keep it as well, as we said, you know, natural without going to the other extreme and making it too noisy. This is a bit abstract, but as we said, I mean, as I said, it comes a little bit as well with practice, and we're having a look at it, and we're having a look at pictures, etc., etc. So yeah, we talked about reusability and silhouette very briefly, and I'm going to be talking about clusters. What do I mean with clusters? So this is a cluster according to SpeedTree. So what's a cluster? So as you can see, this is a bunch of twigs, yeah, with a few leaves, and it's called cluster because this thing, which looks like this, yeah, this is the geometry. This is the guy that's going to be rendered into the texture that's going to go to the famous alpha planes I was talking about before, to this. So where the arrow points. So as you can see, this is going to be covered by those textures, by a diffuse, normal, roughness, you name it, that is going to be creating this image in the end. So let's go back to clusters. So it's very important that you understand what a good cluster is, and you know how to render it properly. And well, this is a good example because you can see that, for example, in here, there's a lot of readability in this silhouette. The actual twigs are separated, but not too separated. There's certain balance in the silhouette as well. And a couple of things that are quite important about clusters. One of them is that the leaves are not overlapping each other. And the other one is that the leaves are facing up. And that's quite important because you're going to be rendering normals out of this guy. So you will have this geometry, but then you are going to be rendering, as I said, normals, diffuses, AOs, roughness, etc., etc. So if you have all the leaves facing up, you won't have artifacts or weird artifacts in the normals. Yeah, so that's something that you have to take into account. And if you have a good cluster and well, it looks good, basically, it's something that will help a lot in the overall look in your final 3D asset. And that's it for me. I think, yeah. So yeah, that would be my brief introduction on Foliage Art. Thank you very much for coming. And yeah, I will be typing my personal email on the questions so that, you know, if anyone, you know, an environment artist who's interested in Foliage Art wants to ask anything, because I know it's a bit of a technical talk and there's a lot to explain. I mean, this is only, as I said, an introduction. If you want to talk to me or you want to ask me something, you can do. So yeah, thank you very much.
Amazing. Thank you so much for that, Ara. I mean, honestly, I didn't realize how much detail there was. I'm going to be taking a lot more in when I'm driving around in games and looking at the foliage. I mean, people in the chat have all been saying how amazing this is and how kind of like detailed it was. So honestly, thank you so much for that. You've got a few questions to answer in the Q&A. It looks like you've got about 7. So people are definitely interested in this. So if you could jump into there, that would be absolutely fantastic. But again, thank you so much.